He who destroys a good book kills reason itself. Censorship is forever a hot-button issue. It touches upon controversial questions of public good, freedom of speech, and whether some ideas are too dangerous to be heard. And it is no surprise that many, many philosophy books have been banned over the years by religions or governments or some mixture of the two. So today, we'll explore those philosophers and philosophies that were considered too hazardous for public consumption, what this tells us about the nature of censorship, and why I think you should definitely read them. Bear in mind, we're going to be covering a lot of territory very quickly, so I'll be giving brief overviews of the works rather than detailed breakdowns. And, as always, I highly encourage you to read them for yourself, as that is far more valuable than any of my videos ever could be. But let's start with one very famous German philosopher, and how he fell under the banhammer. 1. Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morals. Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, and his work more generally, is some of the most controversial philosophy of all time. So it's no wonder that his entire corpus was banned in the USSR from 1923 to 1988. Only pre-authorized researchers and other special persons were permitted to read the man's work. According to a recent paper by Julia Sunieka, there were only 10 dissertations written and defended on Nietzsche in this period. In her view, most of the academic work on Nietzsche in the USSR was not just critical, but seemed to attack a caricatured version of this German philosopher. Much of what I'll say in the rest of this section is from her paper, so I seriously recommend that you give it a read. It's linked in the description. Much of the reason for this ban came from Nietzsche's avowedly anti-socialist and pro-individualist views, and you can see why that might not have jived too well with the Politburo. This animosity was only heightened when Nietzsche's sister corrupted much of his philosophy and used it to aid Hitler's regime in Germany. Nietzsche came to be seen in the USSR as the intellectual backbone supporting fascism, and this provided even more reason to keep up the ban. So what about his ideas did they find so repellent? Well, throughout Nietzsche's works, he criticizes Christianity, socialism, and humanism for ultimately quite similar reasons. He thinks they all promote slave morality. That is, he thought these value systems arose from weak people attempting to constrain the few people powerful and independent enough to fully exercise their wills. Nietzsche argued that early Christians, and primarily St. Paul, gradually corrupted the moral system of pagan religions, which he thought valued strength, vigor, and a lust for life, and instead the ethic of turning the other cheek and the first shall be the last took over. Nietzsche was horrified by this. He saw it as a dishonest, resentful power grab on the part of the weak. It encouraged individuals to limit their own power and to see being powerless as a virtue. Ultimately, he viewed this all as paving the way for nihilism. He thought one of the key drives that imbued humans with a joy for life was our will to power. That is, our wish to both master ourselves and the world around us. This is a complex notion, and I've talked about it a lot in other videos, so I won't go into too much detail here. But essentially, Nietzsche said that with Christianity encouraging us to limit our own power, instead being subservient to God and trusting in a future heaven, we would gradually lose our love for life, especially when we eventually discovered that that religion was false. Obviously, this interpretation of Christianity is very controversial, but, don't shoot the messenger. To this day, Nietzsche's critique is seen as an incisive and philosophically interesting idea that came to influence whole swathes of 20th century philosophy. From anarchist thinkers like Emma Goldman to existentialists like Karl Jaspers to the absurdist Albert Camus. Nietzsche's entire body of work is well worth reading and rereading. But it was not his critique of Christianity that awakened the ire of the Soviet censors. After all, the USSR was explicitly anti-religious. However, Nietzsche also saw socialism as a mere offshoot of Christian ethics, and thus equally worthy of his contempt. He was not like many modern critics of socialism, who tend to argue that it will not achieve its aims of a classless society. Nietzsche thought that this aim was in and of itself undesirable. He did not want society to consider classes at all, but instead put all of their effort into facilitating the few people that he thought were powerful enough to overcome nihilism and eventually craft their own values in a new world beyond the death of God. He was, at the very least, an arch-individualist and an unashamed elitist, both qualities that conflicted heavily with the ideological aims of the USSR. As Sinyekya points out, the relationship between Nietzsche and some of the earlier Bolsheviks was actually pretty complicated. Many socialist intellectuals and later revolutionaries drew from Nietzsche's critique of religion and appealed to his more heroic outlook on life. Nietzsche's idea of creating new values also coheres with what the ruling party of the USSR were attempting to do, supplanting the orthodox Christian outlook of Imperial Russia with their own Marxist-Leninist one. Nonetheless, Nietzsche's philosophy was seen as fundamentally hostile to the USSR, and so he was to be banned. Interestingly, this ban was not entirely effective. Despite the state's best efforts, previous copies of Nietzsche's works did remain in some libraries. Eventually, a less hostile view towards Nietzsche emerged over the course of the 1980s. He was gradually disassociated from fascism, and less polemical treatments of his work began to emerge. The ban was lifted in 1988, and Nietzsche was once again available for public access. But now I want to move from Russia in the 20th century to Italy in the 16th, where a divisive figure sits down at his desk and pens one of the most infamous books of all time. But before we move on, I want to take a brief moment to thank our very kind sponsor for today, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with classes on various different topics. You can find anything from painting to party tricks to website design. I've so far taken their classes on touch typing and music history and interior design, and I've been very happy with the results. At the moment, I'm exploring some of their classes on the note-taking app Notion, since I should really organise my notes a lot better than I do at the moment. I keep losing days of work to misplacing sheets of paper. Skillshare is a long-term sponsor of the channel because I truly have enjoyed learning different skills from them. I feel like accumulating all of these little hobbies just makes life that bit richer. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will get a 1-month trial of Skillshare completely free, so please do check it out. And thank you, the viewer, for watching this interlude the whole way through. 2. Machiavelli's The Prince. Niccolò Machiavelli was a statesman, politician, and philosopher from Renaissance Florence, whose most controversial work, The Prince, secured his place in the annals of history. Some see him as an astute historical and political thinker, who worked out how a state really becomes prosperous and successful. Others saw him as making apologies for tyrants and encouraging rulers to enact extreme brutalities to maintain power. Funnily enough, I have a long video on him currently in the works, so please do stick around the channel for that. The Prince is his treatise on how absolute rulers obtain and consolidate their position. Despite the fact it is one of his shortest works, and Machiavelli's more in-depth book, The Discourses on Livy, is probably a more accurate representation of his overall views, he is still more closely associated with the Prince in public consciousness today. And, to be fair, there are some infamous recommendations in here. For example, when taking a new city, Machiavelli advises that the Prince kill anyone he even suspects of being an opponent. It also contains the famous idea that if you can't be both loved and feared, it is much better to be feared than loved, since that will keep people in line. Machiavelli was extremely critical of other works which advised the ruler to focus on being a virtuous person. For him, virtue in a ruler is fundamentally different to virtue in a private citizen. The citizen has the luxury of worrying about their soul and morality, whereas the ruler's first duty must always be to maintain the security of their state. Having seen city-states in Italy rise, fall, and devolve into chaos, Machiavelli seemed to think that any order is better than no order. Unsurprisingly, this brutal approach to politics attracted the ire of the Catholic Church, who banned Machiavelli's entire works in 1559. Similarly, there was no license granted to anyone to print The Prince in England until the mid-17th century. Machiavelli's name gradually became synonymous with deceit, duplicity, and dastardliness, with this reputation filtering down to our own day through the adjective Machiavellian. However, his work did find some notable supporters, such as the English natural philosopher Francis Bacon. Bacon praised Machiavelli for having the courage to describe the world as he saw it, rather than as he or anyone else wanted it to be. Machiavelli and Bacon shared a similar skepticism about so-called idealists, writing about a reality they really wished to exist, rather than the one that actually did. It's worth noting here that Machiavelli also did condemn tyrants, not just because he thought they were unjust, but because he thought it led to imprudent, unstable, and short-lived governance. There are real questions about just how effective these bans were. For instance, there were numerous copies of Machiavelli's works still in circulation just because of how famous they'd become. This is a theme of many banned books in this period. It was just not that easy to enforce a complete prohibition on a particular book or set of books if there was sufficient demand for it. Bacon is a really good example of this. He defended Machiavelli's approach well before the first officially authorized publication of The Prince in England. There is also evidence of the widespread knowledge of Machiavelli's reputation, if not the content of his works, in this time period. I have no idea if this was some kind of Renaissance Streisand effect, where the bans on Machiavelli meant that his work was read more widely, but I really hope it was. It would really tickle my sense of irony in quite a satisfying way. I think this is a good example of the reasoning often used in censorship. Let's grant for the sake of argument that the church definitely was not being disingenuous, that they genuinely did believe that the writings of Machiavelli were morally corrupting and as a result would condemn more people to hell in their estimation, in which case they thought that reading his book would do untold harm. Ironically, this is exactly the sort of logic Machiavelli was criticizing. Rather than save souls, Machiavelli would think that a ban on his books would lead to less effective rulers, more chaos, and as a result, more injustice in the long term. Much of Machiavelli's advice is framed as choosing the lesser of two evils, however barbaric it looks on its face. Without his guidance, he would probably predict that the greater evils would ultimately come to pass instead. If the Catholic Church's reasoning was, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul, Machiavelli's was, what does it profit the people of a state that a ruler guards his own soul at the cost of all of theirs? But next, I want to examine a book that has been banned in a wide variety of places, largely based on a simple misunderstanding. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. The link is in the description. 3. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Imagine a world where you were permanently happy at a surface level. You had a drug that made you feel joy whenever you wanted. You were completely sexually liberated, and you were designed in a lab to be satisfied with your job. But this came at the cost of your depth of thought, ability to question, and your love for any other person on the planet. This was the world painted by Aldous Huxley in his landmark novel, Brave New World, an absolute classic of dystopian fiction. Of course, I mentioned sexual freedom there, and this is one of the key reasons Huxley's book has faced such backlash. One of the key features of this Brave New World is that there are no lasting relationships or emotional attachments anymore. There are only casual flings or one-night stands. Neither party really cares about the other, and each person is simply used as a vector for pleasure. It is pretty clear in Huxley's book that he doesn't really endorse this position. Almost all of his protagonists share a suspicion of this way of relating to others, and the outsider character, a man named John, is so repulsed by it that he runs away from a young woman who is attempting to seduce him. Huxley appears to be satirizing this free and easy approach to relationships, or at the very least pointing out some of its flaws. Nonetheless, in order to satirize something, you do have to depict it to a certain extent. And so Huxley's novel faced bans for its sexual content, despite that content often being the target of a nuanced critique. It was banned in Australia for opposing family values, even though it's not clear to what extent it actually does. It was also prohibited in Ireland for being blasphemous, since in Huxley's New World, the old faiths like Christianity are just seen as superstitions. Perhaps most famously, people consistently called for Brave New World to be removed from various libraries across the US, often on the grounds that it promoted promiscuity. I find the bans on Brave New World fascinating because they often confuse depicting something with endorsing it. Much of the novel is about how worshipping at the altar of pleasure is not necessarily a good thing. Regarding relationships, Huxley points out how most of the depth of human affection and love is lost in this hyper-promiscuous, strictly no-strings-attached world where marriage and companionship are just seen as old jokes. Similarly, when the Australian government decried it as anti-family, they must have failed to notice how the audience surrogate is neglected by his mother because the inhabitants of Brave New World are themselves anti-family. Huxley was definitely not endorsing this attitude, and in many ways he was fiercely criticising it. This is also consistent with a lot of his later writings, such as After Many a Summer, where he once again takes aim at superficial pleasure being the sole focus of someone's life. I'm not suggesting that Huxley was at all a traditionalist. In his own utopian novel, The Island, he flies in the face of many well-established social norms. But he is definitely not a supporter of the state in Brave New World, like many who've tried to ban the book have seemed to suggest. Anecdotally, I think this is a trap that many people can fall into when reading literature, and it means that a book can attract a lot of anger that is almost entirely unjustified. If you don't pay too much attention to what's happening in the novel and just focus on the setting, you can imagine that Huxley is writing a manifesto for what he thinks is the perfect society. But this would be like arguing that George Orwell was supporting totalitarianism in 1984, or that Macbeth was a glowing endorsement of regicide. I often see similar misinterpretations of works like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment or Notes from Underground, where anti-heroic protagonists with philosophies Dostoevsky is explicitly critiquing are sometimes seen as reflections of Dostoevsky's own views. However, this does deliver its own lesson about censorship. Sometimes a work is banned simply because it is deeply misunderstood by the censors. In Huxley's case, a thoughtful examination of the pros and cons of valuing shallow pleasure above all else was mistaken for a hedonistic treatise, and thus states banned it for promoting the very thing that Huxley was often taking aim at. But a lot of censorship is not based on a misunderstanding. Sometimes a state knows exactly what they are censoring and are doing so out of self-preservation or simple self-interest. 4. John Milton's Areopagitica. The English poet John Milton is most famous for his masterpiece Paradise Lost, which is often heralded as the greatest poem in the English language. However, he also produced a less well-known but just as historically interesting piece. This was the Areopagitica, and that took a lot of tries to say. And it was one of the first published arguments in favour of free speech and free expression ever written. Milton was writing this pamphlet to defy and oppose a licensing law passed by Parliament at the time, which prevented any book from being published if it did not have express permission from the government to do so, along with a host of other measures like the seizure and burning of prohibited books. However, Milton's argument is specifically targeted at that first part, the banning of proposed books before they even had a chance to be published. Milton raised many arguments against censorship in this short piece. He declares the importance of learning, even learning those ideas that may be harmful, since a wise mind will be able to tell the difference, and that the recognition of poor ideas for what they are is often good for the mind, not necessarily bad for it. Thus, these books Parliament was so frightened of should not give them such cause for alarm. In some cases, they ought to welcome them instead. He also thinks that this pre-censorship is an act of supreme arrogance by a state. They are effectively saying that they know in advance exactly what is true and what impact a book will have, even before it is published and its consequences are borne out. In practice, Milton thinks that these pre-censorship measures will just be driven by the bias of whatever official happens to be reviewing the manuscripts. There is no guarantee that they will be particularly learned or that they will take a charitable interpretation of the work. Instead, they may decide to censor on a whim, or because it disagrees with some emotionally held belief they already have. For Milton, there is no one so clever that they can justify limiting the intellect of everyone else in the nation at this pre-publication stage. However, Milton is still a man of his time. He does not think that his Protestant state should tolerate Catholic texts, for instance, nor does he oppose the burning of books in principle. He just thinks that it should happen after publication, when he judges it will have had a fair hearing. This is a far cry from the more modern defences of free expression put forward by J.S. Mill and his wife Harriet Taylor Mill. Milton does not think that people should be shielded from punishment for publishing material that goes against the dominant religion in his country. He just thinks that they should be permitted to publish it and then be forced to bear the legal consequences of that decision. It is what I call the Idi Amin school of free expression, since the dictator once said, "There is freedom of speech, but I cannot guarantee freedom after speech." Nonetheless, it was a freer policy than the one Parliament pursued, since they had already passed their law and so prohibited anyone from publishing any work without first applying for a licence. Since Milton's work was published in explicit defiance of this law, it was effectively banned upon publication, which makes a lot of sense from the perspective of Parliament. They were hardly going to grant a licence to a pamphlet criticising their licensing law. It is also sometimes said that the pamphlet was personally condemned by Oliver Cromwell, but I can't find the origin of this claim, so I'm not sure if it is true, and you should definitely take it with a grain of salt. This essay is really worth a read. It gives a real sense of how arguments for free expression have progressed over time. You can find the germs of later arguments in Milton, and yet there is no hint of the freedom of religion or freedom of conscience argued for in the Enlightenment. It can be a useful exercise in intellectual history to chart how these positions progressed. From Milton saying that Catholic writing should be extirpated, to Locke arguing for more religious tolerance but being intolerant of atheism, to Mill's points in favour of widespread freedom of expression. But, speaking of religion, our next text was banned specifically for questioning some of the deepest held tenets of religious thinking. 5. David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. The Scottish philosopher David Hume was one of the most influential figures of the Enlightenment. He pioneered empiricist philosophy and was adept at identifying areas of thought that did not meet his rigorous standards. He was, above all, a skeptic. He aimed to investigate the limits of human knowledge and what we were justified in believing or even making judgments about. He thought that any proposition worth talking about was either a relation of ideas, and so true by definition, or a matter of fact, which must then be verified by empirical observation. Among his controversial views were that causality did not exist in its traditional sense, that reason was subject to the passions, and that we cannot know whether God exists. In his Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, David Hume gives, effectively, a manifesto for agnostics. Rather than arguing against God directly, he spends much of the dialogue suggesting that our reasoning apparatus is simply not equipped to come to conclusions about deep metaphysical truths like whether God exists. He discusses the argument from design, where the complexity of the world is thought to imply a designer. After all, if we were to encounter a complex object, like a watch or a coat, out in the world, we would infer that there is some intelligent designer behind them. But the universe is infinitely more complex than this, so we ought to infer that it has a designer as well. Hume suggests that despite appearances, we cannot conclude this, because we have only observed complex objects with designers within the universe, and this just doesn't transfer to reasoning about the universe as a whole or anything outside of it. It might hold about biological objects within the universe, but then we can appeal to evolutionary theories to explain this instead. And funnily enough, Hume gives a sketch of a theory of inherited traits here almost 100 years before Darwin does. Likewise with the first cause argument. Even if everything in the universe has a cause, Hume suggests that we cannot apply this principle when talking about the universe itself or anything outside of it. It would be like inferring from observations inside a video game that people must respawn upon death outside of it. In a similar vein, Hume argues that when we say God is the best way to explain something, we are often on quite shaky epistemic grounds. Take the fine-tuning argument, for example. When one of the characters in the dialogue argues that the universe is so well suited for life that God is the best way to explain this, Hume takes some issue. He suggests that any number of hypotheses are consistent with a finely tuned universe, such as a prolific God who keeps designing different universes until he gets one right, or a committee of intelligent beings who come together to make a world, or some incredibly sophisticated but non-conscious force. A lot of theists tend to think that a single intelligent God is more plausible than any of these options, but Hume asks why. He suggests that we cannot even make plausibility judgments like this about events outside the universe. Everything we think of as plausible has been conditioned by our experiences inside the universe. Thus, Hume suggests that we are often far too ambitious in our theological reasoning, and most of us would do better to remain silent both on the existence of God and his purported properties. The dialogues concerning natural religion was not published in Hume's lifetime, but posthumously, and it was banned, along with the rest of his works were already, by the Catholic Church. Hume's seeming atheism or agnosticism caused him an awful lot of trouble in his life. He was denied academic positions, and at points, it even looked like he would be charged with heresy, though thankfully, that fate was averted. But next, I want to look at an incredibly controversial work, written by the philosophical equivalent of a rock star. 6. The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. In terms of raw political impact, there are few thinkers who rival Thomas Paine. He wrote much of the intellectual backbone behind the American Revolution, is considered a founding father, and built on Rousseau and Locke to develop much of the philosophical basis for modern liberal democracies. However, many of his thoughts were not appreciated in his home country of Britain, where his work was censored, and he was even put on trial for sedition, though he did manage to escape this and they had to try him in his absence, which is just much less serious of a threat. Surprisingly, they were not as angry about him being a supporter of the American Revolution as you might think, and Paine safely returned to England after this, where he then wrote a defense of the French Revolution entitled The Rights of Man, which just royally pissed off the British state, as it argued that a citizenry has the inalienable right to overthrow its own government should that government become tyrannical. He argued that human rights were not granted by any state, but were instead naturally given. He thought that a state's job was to guard these rights, and that if they failed in this fundamental duty, then they could justifiably be removed by the people via force if necessary. Though independently philosophically interesting, this work was largely a response to Edmund Burke, who had recently published a harsh critique of the French Revolution and argued in favour of aristocratic and monarchical rule. Paine argued directly against hereditary positions like those found in an aristocracy, as he thought they were totally unjust and that they would also lead to foolish rulers, since there is no reason to think just because someone's parents are good at ruling that they would be as well. It was an all-out attack on the British political establishment of his time, and, unsurprisingly, they didn't like it. It also coincided with fears from Parliament and the Crown that they could face a radical revolution just like the one in France. It certainly didn't help that Paine's book was an instant bestseller. It became the talk of Britain, and it was judged that something must be done. Copies of the book were confiscated and burnt, and Paine would have been hanged had he not managed to flee to France. It was the last time this exiled Englishman would see his homeland, where he was now public enemy number one. Despite this, The Rights of Man made an enormous splash. It is still a classic of political philosophy, and it put forward a serious defense for the French Revolution, which, at that time, was seen by many as evidence that monarchy and aristocracy were the proper forms of government, and that rule by the people would only lead to chaos. I sometimes like to imagine that this shows the ineffectiveness of censorship, that the impact of Paine's work shone through despite attempts to suppress it. And I have seen people argue for this point, but I'm a little less optimistic. While it's true that The Rights of Man had a great impact, was widely read, and is now a classic of 18th century political philosophy, I wonder whether there is a survivorship bias going on. By its very nature, we will only ever find out about those censored texts which manage to overcome this pretty significant obstacle and rise to fame. I can't help but think how many works could have been just as important and influential as Paine's, yet were throttled by the censor's signature, and so we will never know their names. Or the countless others who never wrote their philosophies, knowing that they would never see the light of day anyway. But lastly, we have looked at some books that were banned because they were critical of religion, but one of the most widely prohibited books of all time was itself, undeniably, a little bit religious. 7. The Bible. It sometimes seems strange to call the Bible a work of philosophy, and I often get flack from my fellow atheists when I do, but like almost all religious scripture, it contains a huge variety of philosophical ideas and arguments, from the book of Ecclesiastes and Job presenting ways of dealing with life's meaninglessness or its suffering, to Christ's forgiveness-based universalist ethical system. There is substantial philosophy to be found in these pages. And an awful lot of governments, and sometimes even churches, have sought to restrict who has access to these ideas. Most obviously, this began in the Roman Empire's brutal persecution campaign against Christians. Though I've not found any direct evidence of a ban on what would become the books of the Bible during Nero's reign, he still executed Christians who refused to recant their faith, which I would consider censoring their ideas, if not their actual texts. Then, the Emperor Diocletian declared that Christian scriptures were to be seized and burnt in the early 4th century, and that Christians were to be subjected to various punishments for their beliefs. Diocletian wanted to enforce greater religious unity within the Roman Empire, and Christians simply stood in the way of this goal. Later, when Christianity did dominate Europe, reading the Bible was still restricted in various ways by various parties. Initially, any translation out of Latin was considered suspect because it was thought to corrupt the original meaning of the text. There was also skepticism of ordinary lay people having too much access to the Bible because it was thought that without the proper education and training, they would fall into mistaken interpretations and so put their very soul at risk. These often were not whole bans, but restrictions placed in local areas in response to local problems and local heresies. As a result, they tended to be enforced very unequally throughout Europe. Then, there were more insidious attempts to constrain what biblical ideas people had access to. The most famous example of this is the Slave Bible. This was a censored version of the Bible given to slaves in the West Indies in an attempt to create obedience through Christianity without fostering any of those ideas of equality or freedom. Notable passages were removed, like St. Paul's declaration that there was no difference between a slave and a free man in the eyes of God, and of course, all of the verses in Exodus that explicitly condemned slavery. All in all, around 50% of the New Testament and 90% of the Old Testament were removed. On the other hand, verses about slaves obeying their masters were kept in to encourage subservience. Rather than the Bible being outright forbidden for slaves, it was released in a twisted version which attempted to justify their bondage to them. Unsurprisingly, the Bible also faced significant repression in the USSR. It was never outright banned, but distributing or printing the Bible became increasingly difficult, as did practicing your faith publicly. It conflicted with the anti-religious policies of the state, and so they had a vested interest in eliminating religious belief of any kind wherever they found it. This was not just enacted on Christianity, and the Quran was also subject to major restrictions. Neither Christians nor Muslims were permitted to practice their faith outside of designated places, such as mosques or churches. And these, in turn, were closed regularly. Even today, the ownership or use of the Bible is banned or restricted in many places to a greater or lesser degree. The most extreme example of this is probably North Korea, where the possession of a Bible is considered sufficient grounds for imprisonment, and a tourist was even imprisoned for months for leaving a Bible in a restaurant. I largely bring this up to make a couple of points. The first is that many religious texts are not just spiritual, but also deeply philosophical. The second is that historically, religious texts are often the target of censorship, either by other religions or governments who see that religion as a threat to their governance. Like many of the censored works already discussed, this is often on the basis that they are spiritually or politically dangerous. And the impact such religious ideas and those who believe in them have had on the world, for better and for worse, illustrates perhaps the most powerful lesson we can take from all these attempts to constrain philosophy or literature. The sheer power of ideas and the fear they can inspire in those who wish to suppress them. But if you want to examine these themes of censorship in more detail, then check out this video where I examine the terrifying warnings of George Orwell. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.